have quite a few people that have already joined, and we can maybe do some introductions while folks are still joining the session.
That sounds great.
Michael, you want to start off with introductions?
Sure, sure. Thank you for joining today. My name is Michael Lunzer. I'm the CEO and founder of Itiliti Health, and really excited to be joined today with our primary speaker, Chad Frank. Chad, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes. Good day, everyone. My name is Chad Frank. I am the Chief Product Officer and Operating Officer for the company, and it's nice of all of you to join us today. We're hoping you find this webinar useful.
Great,
Is that the
Chad.
key? All
Do you
right,
want
ready
to
to
go
go,
ahead?
Courtney?
We have a quorum, so I would say we should definitely dive in.
Okay, I'll share my screen and we'll get going. Let me know if the opening slide for the webinar popped up.
Yes, it's showing up.
Wonderful. All right. All right. So what we wanted to talk about today is a topic that we run into quite a bit in our daily dealings with prospects and clients and just talking with others in the industry. And that's about how do we set up our prior authorization systems and technology, and then where does AI come into play? And so what this is designed to do today is to take that topic and go a level deeper and explore and talk about some of the frameworks we see working really well and to help provide some additional information that can help you in your decisions you're making at your organizations. So what the agenda covers four primary areas. We're going to start off today talking about prior authorization, but reframing the topic a little bit. And that is one we see often is that people often look at prior authorization from a workflow, and we're going to talk about, is it a workflow or is it a policy execution challenge you're trying to get into? We'll look at the role and limitations of AI in prior authorization. We'll then move into, now that we've established what is the baseline for prior authorization, where does AI have a role? We'll get in even deeper into the core capabilities to make you successful modernizing your prior authorization. And then at the very end, we'll do some summarization and provide a few key takeaways for you as payers and some additional considerations. However, before we get into that and before we jump into the first topic, this was a last minute ad we had in here. And we want to really set the baseline of what we're talking about today. And this is something that we want everyone to have in the back of their head as we're talking about it. And that is a core tenet of starting with why. And we do this when we build our products. We do this when we're helping clients implement and we're helping them design and architect their systems. That is really what are we here to talk about? And we're here to talk about prior authorization. And really what we want our payers to achieve is prior authorizations that are consistent, explainable, traceable at scale. And at scale means how do I handle 500,000 prior auths coming into my business and ensure they're always that the same inputs get the same outputs every single time, and that I can adhere to the policies and the standards we've set up as our organization. To do that, to make sure you can be consistent and at scale, really what we are our primary point we want to make is our stake in the sand is you need to start with a structured policy. You need to understand how to apply that policy. That really gets into the business rules as your organization. Those tie into the products that you're selling to your clients. And then really get into when you're doing that, the biggest term you're going to see used throughout this deck is deterministic decisioning or deterministic execution. And at its core, that's really every time I go to make a decision, if I have the same inputs, I get the same outputs every single time, and it's not open for interpretation. And then really, when you have that ability, how do I interlay that with my interoperability and all the technology and all the vendors and all the providers I'm working with? What that'll give you is an operational system that can execute your policy consistently with the support of AI. So this deck isn't about AI or not. AI will be there. We're using AI ourselves. It's where and when to apply AI. So that is the foundation of the rest of the deck. It's the why, the how, and the what. So let's start off with the first grouping of topics, and that's reframing prior authorization. What we're seeing today in the market is a couple of three big things coming together. One was the regulatory change from CMS for 0057 on burden reduction. And that is establishing the standards for the payers and the providers and the patients to be able to interact, get the prior authorizations done quickly, share information, and have everyone in the same loop with the information they need. Providers are wanting more real-time decisioning at the point of care in decisions faster so they can have better responses for their patients. And then AI is becoming a daily part of all of our lives. I know I use it every day. I probably increased my usage 10 times over the last year, and I'm seeing that with colleagues, friends, not only in our company, but across the industry as well. And these things in and of themselves are not new, and they're not extraordinary, but they're all coming together at the same time. And what it's doing is it's raising expectations and exposing some limitations of how the three of these things are merging together, right? And so that's really was the impetus of this deck and why we wanted to have more conversations. What we see, and Michael, this is where I might ask for some of your input because Michael is very passionate about this and he does a lot of interactions with clients and prospects, is we see a common approach by clients, and they typically look at three things. First, they look at where is my data today? What systems do I have in place today? And and they don't and what we're finding is there are different ways in different change management things that can take place that you don't have to execute your policy and prior auth the way you're doing it today and just digitize it. And so what they're looking at is, we have faxes coming in today. I have some rules and spreadsheets. My utilization management system has some rules, and they start to digitize that. They start to say, okay, well, this is where the data exists. This is what the workflows look like. How do I start operationalizing these to some of the standards? And then they look at, do we have manual steps that we can automate with some AI or some different processes? How do I take the burden away from the people on my clinical staff trying to authorize prior auths? And then how do I leverage AI on this? And it's a logical approach you'd look at, but it's not one that really addresses the core issue. Michael, anything you want to add to that before we get into what the core issue is?
Yeah. I think the interesting thought that a lot of organizations have when they think about digitizing their workflow is they recognize that their data artifacts are in very poorly structured, unstructured systems, and they get really excited because AI has shown everybody how quickly you can take unstructured data and turn it into structured data with AI. And the perception is that we can leverage that to create our foundation. And I think what we'll talk today a lot about is what is the role of AI in that process? Is that the place where AI makes sense? Because ultimately, what the provider is really needing is a definitive source of truth for the things that they need to do in order to get a prior auth approved.
Thank you. So we'll jump back into we ended it with, it's not addressing the core issue. So if your next big question was great, Chad and Michael, what is the core issue? Well, here's how we see it. Is prior authorization a workflow problem or a policy execution challenge? And the way you define this problem is going to shape how you build your solutions, the technology you're using, and how you think about, executing prior auth in your organization. And then, Anna, do we have a poll we wanted to pop up?
Yep, I'll launch it right now.
Okay. And so throughout this deck, we have a number of polls we wanted to do to get some feedback from the audience as a way to keep you engaged and to learn about what you're doing. And we can look at what you're responding to and answer some of this stuff. So we have 4 of these coming throughout this. So please, if you have a couple seconds here, we'll pause briefly while you answer the poll. Thank you all for those of you who are answering. I really appreciate the feedback. It's always interesting to see the polls update in real time. And this will be a great deck as we're starting to see some of the results come out of this. The premise and the underlying message for this is really starting with a structured policy in rules modernization. And we're seeing some of the polls. That's probably one of the lowest besides AI and machine learning initiatives we see coming in right now. And it looks like we've slowed down. And Michael, any observations you want to make on this, or should we roll into the next section of the deck, and that is AI's role in prior auth? You're on mute, Michael?
Sorry. Yes, I agree with you. The idea of structured policy and rules modernization is really a critical objective in this process in order to facilitate interoperability. So I look forward to further discussing this with you.
Awesome. All right, we'll move in. I'm going to close my poll out and we'll move into, whoop, hold on, give me a minute here. I apologize. The poll popped back up on my screen. All right. So what we're seeing then before we jump into AI and prior authorization, what we're seeing is AI adoption accelerating across the industry. We're seeing major insurers signaling an increased use of AI, despite what some of those polls would say. Some of the stuff we're seeing in the market isn't necessarily reflecting some of the audience we have here, but that's okay. It's just all about the market and people we're talking to. We're seeing AI positioned as a key cost lever. But we're also seeing an increase in regulatory and public scrutiny around AI and how it's being used to make decisions. And there's no shortage of news articles that pop up that we all have access to. And I read them just the same as you on different states or regulatory bodies, passing regulations on can you use AI to make decisions or not. And then at the end of the day, we're running into some clients, depending on the AI vendor or AI solution, is just the visibility into how AI made a decision, which then starts to have some compliance risk for your clinical teams and the decisioning and traceability back to what's happening. So the next section then dives a little bit deeper into AI, and we'll move into that. And again, this isn't a conversation about AI being negative. AI is not negative. AI has a lot of value. And there are three big areas where we see value with AI being used within prior authorization. The first one, in the first use case, even in the medical field or utilization management components of your business, AI is wonderful at data extraction. I know I use it every day when I'm looking at different articles or trying to create summations or doing product specifications. It's wonderful at taking a lot of data, extracting information out of it. And then the next thing a lot of people use it for, it's wonderful at summation. So if you have to look at, if you're a clinical reviewer and you have 300 pages or 100 or even just 25 pages of clinical records, it's wonderful at going through those and providing summarizations for you to understand what's happening and take action on. And then it's also good at having, when you're looking at different activities you may need to be doing, and if you're using AI for some of your workflows, it's wonderful at looking data from across systems and helping you prioritize some of those lists, right? But these are assistive functions. They help you with how work gets done, but they're not fundamentally determine how decisions are made. And that distinction is really important. And that's where we're going to go next is we start to look at where AI is applied beyond these types of tasks. Michael, anything that you had on this one that you wanted to add or talk about?
Again, I think it just feeds into the fact that there are some great places where AI can make a difference. And many of us have experienced its ability to sort through reams of information to find a fact or summarize some information. And so we'll talk a lot about where that applies in the prior auth process.
All right. So now that we talked about what AI is really good at, we're going to start to talk about where AI struggles. And this is where we're starting to get narrow and narrower on the impact and how you develop and define your prior authorization systems. AI, and again, this is not, I'm using this term very broadly. We as a company, we're talking to other partners in companies in this industry of looking at how do we develop partnerships and work with them that are doing a lot of this work in AI. And there's a lot of really good things to do. So again, I'm using these terms broadly, and this doesn't apply to every AI company or every solution. And I want to be very clear on that. I'm using this contextually as a whole. And AI as a whole, based on where we are with generative AI in the world, is it struggles with context-driven decisions. Okay, so for example, determining which policy applies to a specific patient or scenario isn't always straightforward. It depends on context. It depends on interpreting the policy. It depends on understanding how that policy may apply to your line of business, how your benefits are designed, where are there exceptions, and all those different components have to interact to come up with an output, right? And it's not always straightforward. And a lot of times the policies that AI is trying to interpret are written in a narrative form designed for human consumption and people to use. They're not designed inherently in their current state. We're finding that a lot of payers, whether they're in a PDF or a Word or an HTML document or buried in a system somewhere, that are designed for codification or structured data to be used within technology systems. Okay. And what happens when you start to do that, you start to get variability. And so if you're trying to interpret and you know that you have a bunch of different rules and exceptions you're applying, that variability is where you start to get those nuances and you don't have consistency. And we talked about that earlier on deterministic decisioning is what we want based on how we're operating our businesses and what the policy is designed to do. We want consistent outputs for consistent inputs when we're asking questions, right? And we're trying to limit that variability and we're trying to put control back into the system. And this is just where we're talking about is it doesn't mean that AI fails, it just struggles, right? And we want consistency for our payers.
If I can illustrate that just a little bit specifically, if you think about a policy that may have a written set of rules that individually say the patient must have these 10 criteria met, and some of these other criteria met, and you ask AI a question to look at a medical record and determine if those criteria are met, in a broad sense, AI will take all of that information and go look and see if those criteria are met. A more structured system would ask AI individually, is this one criteria met? Yes or no, and where, and go on to the next. So the difference is pointing AI as a tool at a broad set of information and asking it to give rulings or interpretations versus a very narrow set of information.
Thank you, Michael. All right, so let's talk about what happens when you start to look at AI, and this isn't information that is we're making up here, and a lot of this is coming from other research articles. And stuff changes. The things we talk about in this deck today are going to be completely different in our world a year from now, and definitely different 5 years from now. But this information I'm talking about here came out of a Peterson Health research paper that was written, that is published on the internet, and what they were seeing in the payers they were talking to, and then what they were doing with AI is it was creating some system effects that weren't necessarily foreseen, and that was increasing case activity, right? And that's not necessarily because there was more requests, but because there was more interactions required to reach a decision. And so when you have a system trying to interpret a policy in context in real time, and you're a clinician reviewing that, and if there's back and forth you need to get clarity on, that's what we're talking about, is increased case activity. That if you can't always trust the answer or there's lack of clarity, it was creating a lot of additional case activity outside of the norm. What they're also seeing is that when providers were using AI at times to help populate prior auth submissions, and the payers were using AI to help make some of those decisions, it started to create a lot of what can be termed as a bot war. The bots were trying to interact with each other, exchange information, and interpret what they were saying. Not necessarily that that's a bad thing. And again, it's more activity here doesn't necessarily mean better outcomes, right? It just means more activity, right? And then also there was little proof at this time whether AI was truly providing cost savings for their organization. And the key point here is that if the underlying approach where the AI is trying to interpret policy during workflows, it often requires more interaction and more iteration to reach a decision.
Hey, Chad.
Yes.
We got a question in the chat that I think is applicable to this slide. Could
Sure.
I ask you and Michael?
Of course.
Can you explain more about what you're referring to when you use the term AI? For example, LLM plus chatbot, agentic tools, some combination.
Yeah, great question. We're not trying to really define very specific use cases. It can mean all those, right? There is AI is wonderful, and we're going to talk about how to use it. And so I'm going to repeat this again. I'm not trying to dispel AI or say it doesn't have a use case here, but it has a use case when the term you'll see is within guardrails or specific things. So in some of these research articles, it was all of a combination. Sometimes AI is wonderful if you're trying to fill out a form and you want to have a clinical record and you can have AI extract the data you need and how to pre-populate that form. That's wonderful. If you have agents created to go out and grab information and try to find it and embed it into the system or drive some workflows, when you have very specific use cases with rules that can follow, it does a wonderful job there. So this was just a broad use of AI with no really specifics from this Peterson Health article. And again, I'm making some generalizations here just to the point is not to drive to a specific decision, but to create awareness in everyone's head and just pause for a second and go, how are we really trying to do this in our organization? And are we applying the right technologies for the right problem set?
And I think just again to reiterate your answer, we're speaking about AI broadly, not AI in any one of those specific implementation approaches.
Yep. Any other questions, Courtney?
No, not right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, I'll jump on as we see them populate. But just as a note for the audience, if you drop your questions into the Q&A, I'll grab them and ask Michael and Steve as we continue.
Right. Wonderful. So just a quick summarization on, we started with the reframing the first topic of is prior authorization a workflow problem or a policy execution challenge? We just finished up the section on as a high level AI use in prior authorization as the market's seeing it today. And this in the summary of that is what a lot of people were seeing or expecting out of AI was faster, lower cost, and simpler. But some of the research and some of the articles are pointing to it's increasing case activity. There's unproven savings, and in very complex cases, and this is where a lot of the time is spent with prior auth is that those complex cases that get pended, you have to do a lot of review on. It was having limited impact in there. So the summary here is efficiency gains don't always gain better results, right? AI is clearly effective at reducing manual effort in very specific areas and specific steps. But when positioned as trying to interact with an entire system with multiple workflows, multiple technologies, multiple interaction points, it doesn't necessarily impact the entire system as a whole as it can with individual discrete tasks.
And Chad has referenced a couple times in this conversation the study that was done by Peterson Consulting. We'll make sure that's available to everybody at the end of this webinar as well.
And Michael, Anna and Courtney worked on 3 white papers. There are links within those white papers to those as well too. So I believe the white paper number 2 has links within that as well. So if you download those from our website or on our blog post, we also will provide it there. But if you happen to miss it, we've provided other places for you to get it.
Those are available. We'll link those at the end of the session, but those are available on our website as well. And we do have a downloadable version of them that we can share with you if that's helpful for use across your organization.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Michael. And Anna, I believe you have another poll we're going to do on some of the biggest challenges payers are facing right now.
I launched it.
Thank you. We have people interacting as we're talking.
We really do appreciate your participation in these polls. Couple of things that they help us with. We're in live in our webinar, adjusting our message to make sure we address some of the things that we would anticipate being questions or concerns for those of you based upon your answers. And of course, these poll questions also help us in the future to tune the next webinar. We do have multiple webinars coming up that will continue in this theme.
All right, it looks like we've slowed down on people answering the questions. So thank you for those folks who have answered that. We greatly appreciate that. And I'm trying to look for any clear topics to go through on the polls. What's interesting is over half of you who responded have said that you have not implemented AI in prior authorization. All right, we'll move on to the next slides. So to summarize this chapter of the PowerPoint, AI does definitely improve efficiency, but AI does not necessarily solve policy execution. And that's where we're going to get into the next section is core capabilities that we believe will change how the industry solves prior authorization. All right. This slide provides the foundation for a lot of additional discussions as we move forward. And it talks about the foundation, whether you're using AI or whether you're using tools like Itiliti Health. And that is, how do you provide the foundation and baseline information to run your prior authorizations? And where we want people to be thinking about is the policy that's being written. Health payers spend a lot of time, or if they're buying them from, delegated vendors like MCG or Interqual, or they're outsourcing that to third-party administrators, there's a lot of time spent on writing policies that help ensure that the patient is getting the best treatment possible. And these policies start to form a contract to when a patient has a certain ailment or a diagnosis and they need a certain procedure, what is the best way to accomplish that, right? And the policy, the part of the policy that really where the rubber meets the road is the medical necessity definition, or the term we'll be using is clinical criteria. That clinical criteria can be very complex. In the work we're doing, developing some of our fire questionnaires and taking that clinical criteria that has been written for human consumption and turning into executable machine code that again gets in, that helps you with part of your deterministic decisioning, is putting structure to that. And that is the foundation of putting structure to your policy. The next thing that is really important is, now that I have the policy, how do I understand when to apply that policy? And that's the scope, right? And this gets into the different products you're selling as payers, right? So if you have a policy that is at a line of business, but you're selling certain products to some of your clients, and you're breaking those out, or you have exceptions by group or client specific benefits packages you're selling, that policy might have slight modifications on certain procedure codes. So if a policy has, 30 or 40 different procedure codes, but this group or this company, 10 of those don't require prior auth, or they might require prior auth in these certain scenarios, that's where the scope starts to come into play. So you start with the baseline structure of the policy, you understand when to apply it, and then the rules come in of how to apply it. And that's where you start to get the combination of the policy, what's been sold, and benefits packages, and trying to combine those all together. And the words we'll be using throughout this presentation is a structured policy and applicability. Applicability in this conversation is how I apply all the rules and benefits, exceptions and carve outs to that policy, depending on who the patient is. And that becomes important, because what we're going to talk about is how Itiliti Health and how we believe the market needs to go, by putting all that in a very structured format that allows you to execute that policy and those rules consistently every single time you're running a prior auth. When you're able to do that, what that allows you to do is have what's called a deterministic decision. And I was first introduced to this term talking to a chief medical officer a fair while ago, when they were talking about, we need to make deterministic decisions, and it caught me off guard a little bit. And I started looking at it, I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, right? Every time, if we have all these complexities with policies and rules and carve outs, so how do I know that every time that I submit something for a prior auth, that the same data going in gets exactly the same outputs every single time? And that's deterministic decisioning. And you can do that when you have a structured policy that's computable. You can do that when you understand that policy, how it relates to all your business rules. And when you have that, now your compliance teams and your clinicians can go, okay, now I know that if I have to ever go back, if there's ever a case that needs to be adjudicated, I can trace this back to how the decision was made, and it's not open for interpretation. And this is a huge benefit even moving forward, even without what's been happening in the industry with Itiliti Health and in some AI vendors and all the changes with CMS. Is before, everything was open to interpretation. It was a human trying to interpret what somebody else wrote, and then trying to interpret what a provider said. And now we can move away from that. We can put this stuff into computable, executable form. And so when you have the underlying structure of the policy and the rules, you get consistent decisions. You can trace them back to their sources. And the best part of all, if you're running 500,000 to 1,000,000 prior auths a year, it's repeatable. It happens at scale, but because you've created the foundation for that. And the next slide really represents that. And this just represents not a specific company, but when Michael and I are talking to clients, and this represents an average size payer, and this average size payer down the middle of the slide says that they have approximately 400 policies. And of that company, they do about 450 prior authorization transactions a year. In an interpretive review for this, on the left-hand side of the slide, and this can be either how you're doing it manually today, or if you drop AI or other tools into it, it's interpretive. And what you end up seeing is a bunch of cases that need to be reviewed. They line up in a queue. Somebody grabs the case. They try to ensure they know the right policy to apply to it and the right procedure codes. They're interpreting that policy. They're interpreting how the rules need to apply from benefits. And they're trying to make decisions. Is this case approved? Is it pended? Is it denied? What do I do with it? And you rinse and repeat that 450,000 times. The same thing can happen. We're seeing in the use of AI in some of the scenarios as well too, where AI will grab the case, it tries to interpret the policy, and again, it's AI trying to interpret, not having a deterministic decision, and then it interprets the medical records, and then it tries to make decisions. And AI isn't always making the decisions, and the good companies that are out there aren't saying that AI is going to make the decision. It will inform somebody of a potential decision to be made, but the good ones will never deny it. But again, that's a rinse and repeat a 500,000 times a year, right? And you lose consistency because you start to get drift in interpretation. You start to get shadow policies. And we started off this deck by saying the core thing we're trying to do is to have consistent prior auth results. That was the why we started with. So how do you do that? On the right-hand side of the screen represents an illustration of how you do that. You start with a structured policy. You understand how to apply that policy to all your business rules and your benefit packages. That means the association of procedure codes, effective dating of all this information, how it applies to groups and programs. And then when you have that, the really cool thing is you can automate a very large portion of this. And we'll talk more about what we're seeing at Itiliti Health later on in this presentation. But of your 450,000 transactions, we're proposing that you can automate the approval because you have the structured data to make decisions on not only in your policy but through the new fire standards. You're getting the diagnosis codes, you're getting the information in a computable standard that you can apply to rules to make that happen. Then what you have at the end of the day is a very small percentage that need to go into very deep clinical review, and this is where really we're saying AI comes in to really support that and help that. So on your exceptions, on those ones that you can't automate, AI plays a critical role in helping you do that. Anything you want to add here, Michael, before we get into AI's role here?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key points. There was a question as well that I'll address. First of all, when we're speaking about structured deterministic review and structured data, essentially what we're talking about here is if you have a policy, that policy ultimately needs to be converted into a line-by-line detail of what the rules are, or in the case of CMS 0057, what the question is for the provider. Those line-by-line questionnaires need to be created using human resources, not AI, because you want those policies to essentially align perfectly with your human readable medical policy. And then that structured questionnaire and data, for instance, the procedure codes that apply to a policy, those are stored in a database so that this data doesn't use AI in its raw form. It's actually deterministic data. It's fixed rules. And then when a provider submits a prior authorization, that prior auth is submitted to the correct policy because that policy procedure code relationship is fixed, and the group coverage under a particular policy is in the database. So now we're applying that policy to that submitted prior auth to the correct policy. The policy has a list of questions, and the provider answering those questions generates that automation and approval of the process. For those prior auths that are submitted that don't meet the requirements based upon the provider submitted answers to questions, those are the prior auth submissions that need additional assistance by AI. And we'll talk more about what that specifically looks like here. But so ultimately what this means is we're doing everything we can to get to a yes. And for those that have a no, those get or append, those go to an AI assistant. But in those cases, AI is a human in the loop process. So AI never makes a no decision. It can find data for the individual who's making that decision, but it's not actually making the decision. And so I think when you talk about the key question here was, how is this being received by different regulators? I think what we're finding is most regulators are saying AI cannot be used to deny care. And if AI is used, they want to see clear indications of how it was used and where it was used, and even then that it is not making a no decision.
Another question submitted or comment submitted for the two of you that piggybacks on your response that you just gave, Michael. AI can only decide up to a point because the criteria should be applied in the context of the patient's medical condition, values,
Mhm.
and desires. So the right decision can be different for different patients.
Mhm.
Definitely. And
Yeah.
again, that's our approach is that AI is there really to be a really efficient tool at finding data for the human who's making the decision. And so it can
I was going to say
assist.
our next slide. I'm sorry, Michael. I thought you were
Go
finished.
ahead.
My apologies.
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say our next slide kind of covers where you were going is, how do you use AI? How do you use AI to become more efficient and still allow the best decision for the patient with allowing consistency and traceability for the payer as well, too. And we kind of talk about there's a lot of really awesome areas to apply AI there, and that's what our next slide covers. Okay. So now that we said, all right, let's look at the exceptions. I'm going to take you back in time, and we're going to go back 20 minutes. In one of the slides I covered about 20 minutes ago in our DeLorean time travel machine, is we talked about what AI is good at, and we talked about AI as extracting data and summarizing it, right? And so when we get down to these 15% of the cases, and you're a reviewer, and you have this medical policy open up with 30, 40, 50, 100 data points on clinical criteria, and on your other screen, you're opening up 150, whatever you want, 50, even 20 pages or more is a lot, but even sometimes it's 100 plus pages of clinical documentation. That's where you use AI. That's where you say, all right, AI, here's my clinical criteria. Take this very specific criteria, go find this for me, extract this out of here and summarize what it's doing. Help me figure out how I make a decision. Help me understand and make sure I'm not missing something when I read it. And that's where it looks at. So AI's capabilities, what we have here is when you stack it on top of this structured data and structured policies is phenomenal. And we're just talking about some of the stuff we do here, but AI and some of the companies we're talking with now are just doing tremendous work there in some of these areas. And what we have here is the AI capability and benefit when you put it on top of structured data. And some of these apply to prior auth, some of them it doesn't, right? Like we talked about data extraction. How do I find the one sentence or the 10 characters I need out of 200 pages? Let AI go do that. Don't spend your time reading the documents. That's where it comes in wonderful. Highlight that for me and let me know how it applies to what criteria. And should I say it matches or it doesn't match, right? It can help with workflow guidance. And this might happen outside of prior auth. So if I'm looking at information or you need to fill in something, how do I extract something to fill in a form I may need to populate on my side in my system? Like, go grab this data, help me populate it. How do I communicate what we're seeing? Summarize this for me so I can put this into a form where I submit it through the approval chain, right? So again, this is where the rubber's been meeting the road the last two slides. Looking at structured data, how that impacts your overall business, and how do I even enhance that further utilizing AI? So when you have structured environments with the core data you're making decisions, you're gonna have better AI outcomes. Anything you wanted to add here, Michael?
Nope.
And then Anna, I think we have a poll coming up maybe in two more. I think I might have missed that. So I think it's in two more slides. We have a poll coming up. All right. So now that you know how to make a decision and you can apply that decision, let's talk about interoperability and how to put AI in some guardrails, right? And so what we've talked about so far in our premise is start with structured data, understand how to apply rules to it. And now that you have a system and a means to do that, how do I drop that into and really make things happen? And one of the great things that's happening now with the CMS standard are standards like CRD, that is the APIs in the communication between the payer and the provider of is authorization required. There's DTR, right, which is the formalization of structured data of, great, I need to submit a prior auth. What data do I need to submit to it? How do I answer your detailed FHIR questionnaires? And then what really wants to happen is now that you have these structures of submitting a prior auth, which is the PAS, another one of the endpoints for CMS 0057, that allows the provider to submit a prior authorization to the payer. Now what you want to do is this is where you get into deterministic decisioning. We got to find a better word as an industry to use. It's hard for me to say repeatedly. But once you have the structured data and you can make decisions, now you need to do that at scale fast. We want to get at the point of care, try to get these answers to the doctors and ultimately for the patients answers they need. And you can do that. Then when you need to apply AI and you can consistently give decisions, now let's put some guardrails on it. It's not about throwing AI on top of everything and saying, tell me what to do. It's about saying, help me in these specific use cases and help me be even faster on my exceptions. So this is really about the three big areas we've been talking about is structured data, understanding how to make decisions, and then dropping this into your frameworks for interoperability and allowing AI to help you be even better and faster at it. And really what you need to get scale, you need to control the data and how it's being used and control how your technologies are interacting and helping your end users make decisions. Okay. So what does this model look like? This is just a visual summarization of what we've been talking about. We move from left to right on this illustration, and you start the underlying foundation is you start putting structure to data, and really the part of the policy, the part of the policy you really want to put structure to, that's the medical necessity definition, the clinical criteria. And what we do and we're a proponent of is we have tools that allow you to take that and put that into really well-defined questionnaires. And that is looking at all the criteria, the ands, ors, if this, then that, one of these, two of those, how do I make decisions? Put that into a structured form and then turn that into a questionnaire, a FHIR-based questionnaire. And FHIR is a technical term used to define a standard that allows payers and providers to communicate. And when you do that, I can send a defined FHIR questionnaire over to the provider and say, fill in this information with your structured data. When I get it back, I can apply rules to that. I can understand the patient, what benefits they have. How do I apply my line of business rules, my carve outs, my exceptions, part of their benefits information? That allows you to have that deterministic decisioning engine. That's the core of all this. When you know how to make a decision, and you can repeat it and you're consistent and it's traceable, you can drop that into your interoperability framework. That's where you start saying, okay, I just plug this into my APIs and I know this system needs to call this information to get the right data, and I can push the information or results to my utilization management system. And really you're taking the ability to make a decision into your interoperability framework, and you wrap that with AI to help you be more efficient and faster at pushing those through. So again, policy defines, interoperability delivers, and AI helps you optimize. That's our core message. Michael, anything before we go? And I know Anna has a poll here.
No, Anna?
And as you're filling that in, we've been using some terms, we've been talking about some concepts, and unless sometimes it's easy for us to talk about it because we're in the weeds. We have these conversations day in and day out. We're helping payers how to architect their entire interoperability framework specific to prior auth. And so some of the terms we're using, are very common to us. But if you have any questions about what do you mean in this answer of explicit applicability rules, or making determination or deterministic decisions, or some of these concepts we haven't done a solid enough job tying them all together, please feel free to ask a question. We want to make sure that we're using language and descriptions that are common for the vast majority of people. And sometimes our audience can vary from chief medical officers to data analysts to clinicians. And so it's hard to figure out sometimes the right terminology, the right illustrations and graphics. But if you have any questions or something, if it isn't absolutely clear, please feel free to ask us a question. We'll answer it here, and we'd be happy to do that. Looks like the polls have stopped. It's good to see that a lot of the people are thinking about structured and governed policies. It looks like we have some more work to do to start explaining the how to talk more about the explicit applicability of rules. So, any questions that have come up, Anna, Courtney, or Michael?
No?
All right, we'll move on. Thank you all for your participation in the polls. It's greatly appreciated.
Actually, Chad, someone had asked you to repeat your core message comment that you made at the end of the slide.
Sure. A lot of times stuff just comes, sometimes my mouth moves faster than my brain. I'm trying to remember exactly what I said, but I think I was repeating the footer. And that really is, at the end of the day, it goes back. I'm not going to jump. Oh, man. I'm going to jump back up. Hold a minute. I'm going to jump back up to this slide. It goes back to this. Ultimately, what we're trying to solve is prior authorization is not about having a human or a system interpret data. It's about trying to put the right tools and information in place that allows you to execute a decision that's consistent and repeatable. And so, really, what I was talking about is if I want to have consistent, explainable decisions at scale with prior auth, I'm talking about the orange area here. How do you do that, Chad? How do you do that, Itiliti Health? And that's really you start with your policy. You take this narrative policy that teams have spent hundreds of hours writing, and you take that, and we have tools that will do this for you. And instead of writing these in Word, and instead of writing these in PDF and publishing to a website, we have a tool that actually allows you to build your policies and maintain them. But the most important thing, it allows you to structure that medical necessity clinical criteria into executable machine logic. So not only can you build a policy that's readable for humans, because providers and everyone else should need to see it, but it also allows you to build the core technology underlying it that you can run it through these interoperability layers. Then there's another rules engine we have that says, okay, great, you have a policy, but how does that policy apply to, let's just say you sell to 3M, or you sell to Donaldson Corporation, or you sell to Pizza Hut, and Pizza Hut has their own said, well, Pizza Hut doesn't require prior auth for a knee surgery, but this other company does. Those are your internal rules, and those are the benefits packages being sold by your organization, and they all have to come into play. And most companies don't have a way to manage all this together. They're in disparate systems. Policies are in Word documents. There's spreadsheets for is prior auth required for this company. There's utilization management systems that might house other benefits packages information. And so we provide the framework to put all this together and make it deterministic and executable versus interpretation. That's what I was really trying to get to at the end of the slide. Anything I missed there, Michael, you want to talk about?
No, that's great. Thank you, Chad.
You're welcome. We got 10 minutes left, a handful of slides. I'm going to pick up the pace ever so slightly here, and because there's some core slides I want to get to. So this slide, and we'll provide these slides afterwards, really says, well, that's really cool. So help me understand the difference in how the entire system operates between a deterministic model and an AI-driven model. And really, this is just a summation of some of the stuff we went back to, and it's really how you decide to make, how you need to make decisions, or how you're making decisions determines how a system behaves. And this goes back to, do you want to interpret a policy and have probabilistic outputs by either human or AI interpretation, or do you want to put structure to it so it's executable and it is consistent? Do you want to have an increase in system activity, or do you want to reduce work? We're going to talk about, and we'll show you at the very end, of how you can automate a very large portion of these if you put structure to it and rules to it. And so I'm going to jump to the next slide. And the next one is, there's 5 areas to look at when you're trying to do this. So we talked about how the system behaves in the last slide, and now I want to talk about, how you approach this and really what the system does, or how it interacts on this side. So, in a AI driven model or a human interaction model, the difference between a policy is either structured or it's narrative. When you talk about applicability, you're either defining that in a set of rules or you're inferring it. Are your decisions deterministic or are they probabilistic? So again, depending on the tools and technology you're using and how you build all this is going to determine how your systems are really behaving. And this is a core message. So before we as we keep going here, this slide talks about, well, this is all wonderful, what does that really look like? All right. And so this is a represent, not to try to sell Itiliti too much, but this is a representation of how we view the world and where we're seeing our payers get a lot of benefit and helping them accelerate in the market and get ahead of where they need to be. So really what you want is you want your policies still need to be authored by clinical teams. And in that policy, when your clinical teams are authoring them, they need to have structured computable criteria. You also need to understand and have rules of how you apply that policy to different parts of your business. The common nomenclature is I have policies that can apply to a line of business. I have policies that can apply to groups or multiple groups. And I have program logic, right? And so how do you build all those rules to determine that? And when you do that and you build that all into the system, which we tried to represent on the right-hand side of the screen with the illustration, you end up with see, here we go again. We got to find a better word, deterministic decisioning. When you can make a decision, then it's easy. It's plug and play. You just plug in your fire generated outputs, your APIs, and the systems start talking to each other based on agreed upon industry standards. And then when you need to, AI drops in on top of all this and helps support you in very specific workflows within well-defined guardrails. Okay. So what I want to do is talk about some of the key takeaways for this deck. I'm going to try to leave us a little bit of time at the end. And what I want for you as payers and for anyone listening is 4 key points. AI is really valuable and it's a wonderful tool. And we build it in our application. We're looking at including it in more and more things we're doing. We're looking at different partners who do wonderful things in the marketplace out there with AI. And we're looking at how do we have some of these synergies with the structure we bring to the really cool things AI can do. But it isn't a golden ticket. It's not a golden ticket for for prior authorization. It's not, I have spreadsheets and I have this vendor over here and my system has some of this data and there's a PDF document over here. And I just point AI at to it and say, help me make a decision, right? Because then you have variability. Policies must be governed and structured. They have to be to make this scale and where we need to take the entire industry. We need to start there. We need to have deterministic decisioning. That's taking your structured policy and applying rules to it. And then we need to use AI. It just makes everyone's world just a little bit better and our workflows a little bit better every day. But we need to do it within guardrails. We need to apply it very specifically to what we're doing. So a very final thought I have, and then we have one more. I said final thought, but I actually have one more slide after that. And our final thought is this for you as payers. Can your systems today apply your policies in the right context at scale? And if they can't, we'd love to talk to you. And the next slide is what does that look like with Itiliti Health? And Michael, this came out of a slide you built, so I'll let you talk to this because you spend time talking about this every day. But this is the final slide on some of the value in the 5 products we have at Itiliti Health, which, by the way, does all this.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. Wonderful presentation. Love to cover the details of the Itiliti Health product line. So when we think about this, we work the model from top to bottom. So of all of the prior auths that could possibly ever be submitted, there needs to be a way to filter out, help providers to know when they shouldn't submit a prior auth, when they don't need to. And so that's what our product PA Checkpoint does. It's a system where the payer can configure their rules. That configuration can be done through ingestion of other artifacts, the spreadsheets and other systems. But ultimately, it's a system where the health plan can expose a transaction either to the CRD transaction in interoperability or to a public website where somebody can come in and enter some data to immediately get an answer that's a defined deterministic answer. Does this require a prior auth? And if so, what policy applies? Next up in this flow, policy management is the Itiliti Health tool where we convert policies from purely human readable policies into a combination of human readable and machine readable versions. The tool allows the health plan to work through the workflow of creating and managing policies and editing versions. Those policies then have defined questionnaires for each particular policy. And that means that when a provider submits a prior authorization, they are answering and attesting to whether or not their member meets those individual criteria elements. Our product line also knows where to route prior auths so that if there's a downstream delegated vendor, those vendors' rules and capabilities are brought into the workflow. And then again, because we have defined rules within the medical policy and a deterministic set or flow to that policy, we know that if the provider answers the first 5 questions or some number of questions yes and enters the right information in a couple of fields, we can automate the answer in real time. And so we've seen auto authorization rules without defined forms, automating 50% of prior auths. We anticipate 85% to 90% of prior auths determined by these deterministic rules when providers begin filling out questionnaires. So that leaves a very small percentage of prior auths that fall down to the very bottom of this funnel, which are those prior auths that really need a human to review those and compare the medical record to the medical policy. Because our medical policies are now in a system that separates out each of the criteria of that policy, we can apply AI with guardrails to identify where in the patient's medical record there's evidence that they meet each of those policy criteria elements and show that to a live clinical reviewer or medical director to assist them in making a decision faster and with better information. So that's essentially the summary of the Itiliti Health product line. Chad, I'll throw it back to you for final words.
My final words are nice work, Michael. Courtney, any questions?
Yes, we got a couple of questions if we have a moment to answer them. One, what does the DTR stand for? You mentioned prompting the provider with the fire questions. You need to apply the AI platform. Can you expand on this? We find the provider medical records often lack the necessary elements needed to adjudicate the case. How do we get the structured data from the providers?
Yeah, that's a really exciting question because with CMS 0057, what is ultimately going to happen, and it will happen in an evolution, but in a perfect world, each payer's medical policy will have very specific questions asking the provider, is the patient older than 18? Do they have a BMI greater than 50? Or if if they don't have a BMI greater than 50, do they have a BMI greater than 40 and have diabetes? So those are examples of deterministic questions that will be sent to the provider. And so instead of submitting documents, the provider will see those questions and be allowed to submit documents. Those questions can then be answered within the electronic medical record system so that when the they're doing it quickly and easily inside of their electronic medical record system, and the payer, clinical reviewer, gets a fully answered questionnaire and or documents attached. And that just ultimately makes it easier for the payer to make a decision because they have all of that necessary information.
Perfect.
Was there another question, Courtney?
There is. The current human system doesn't meet the standard of providing consistent decisions at scale. So the use of AI could potentially improve the human decisions with an understanding that the decisions must be nuanced and therefore some variation is to be expected and accounted for. Not phrased as a question, but I thought of a good statement for you to react to.
Yeah, we would completely agree that in those cases where a decision hasn't been made to answer yes, that's when AI can come in and help find more information and surface that for the live clinical reviewer so they can make an effective decision. So again, we're striving to get to yes as quickly as possible. And when we don't get to yes, we want to be able to give it the most thorough review before there's a no, and that no has to be made by a human.
Those were all of the questions that we had for this session. So we want to thank everyone for attending. If you would like to schedule a demo with our team, we are happy to do that. You can reply to the email that you received for this, or you can connect with either of our panelists, Chad Frank and Michael Lunzer. Chad, I apologize for calling you Steve a little bit ago.
I didn't even
I'm so
notice.
we appreciate all of your time. If you have additional questions, we are happy to answer them. We'll also be distributing the replay of this event. I know we got that question a couple of times. We will distribute the replay. We will also be resharing the AI article series that we published over the last 2 weeks. Wishing everyone a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody. Great job, Chad.
Thanks, Michael. Same to you.